Yes, please start your lecture. Okay?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much to the invitation today to talk, to have the possibility to talk about my research and to give a little insight in what I'm doing. As I was already introduced, I will keep it short and simple. My name is Dominik Michalitz, and as you see, we are already working about my Japanization, I would call it. So my name is now translated into kanji due to some very helpful and friendly colleagues. And I'm trying to get more into cultural phenomenons of Japan day by day, but it's a hard task for me, if not to say an extreme task. But today, extremes, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about, extreme experiences and cultural self-regulation. So my today's goal, I would assume, is the following. I would like to give a short introduction on my field of research, what I'm doing. I would like to contextualize extreme experiences in the field of I work in. I would do a little presentation, let's say, of an initial theoretical framework to explore the significance extremes can have in our life. What can extreme experiences do to us? How can we make sense of them? And also to give maybe a different perspective than just a pathologization of how severe negatively we can be affected by extreme experiences. And most important, I would say, is not my talk. It's more the last 30 minutes we are going to spend together. I would like to conclude in an exchange and maybe exchange of ideas and engagement in cooperation is Tetsuya already introduced. I'm here for a year, sponsored by JSPS, and I would really like to make the best out of the time, also in the sense of collaboration, getting new insights, inspiration, and hopefully working with some of you together in the next 12 months of my stay. So what's the project timeline? Basically, I'm within my so-called, in German language, habilitation project. I'm tenured as assistant professor working on my promotion for associate professorship, which means to do quite a huge project, let's say over 6 years. My project started in last year in October 24 by looking at extreme experiences from an objectively defined versus culturally and personally perceived situational understanding. Bringing me this year, which I call the Japanese phase, JSPS funded time to Japan, doing cultural analysis and compare cultural records, for instance, interviews, media images, with individual evaluations to understand universal versus subjective extremes. So my uh, big interest is to get to know when does something become extreme, how does it construct, how do we understand that something becomes severe extreme to a human being, and then later on how we make sense of that. The final conclusion, well, a little bit difficult to give a forecast already right now, as this is going to be in October 2030, where the final evaluation of the whole project should be. Basically, so far as I see it now, I'm working, let's say, at the edge of performance and psychology with clinical psychology and cultural psychology as fields of application, linking extremes to peak achievements and examine overlaps with abnormal behavior in clinical psychology. So, how did I get all into this project, let's say, or how did I get all into my work of extremes? Well, it started all very superficial, I would say, on an observational base, or what I would like to call a first phenomenological approach. So, being totally honest and open-minded to you, I would like to do the same as I normally tell my students. Research always has also some part to do with our own personalities, and maybe this was the part how I went into this field of research myself within clinical psychology and psychotherapy. It was looking at sports. I'm very eager or interested in doing ultra running. For those who are not familiar with what ultra running means, basically it means doing races that are longer than a marathon. So anything that is above 42.2 kilometers. Um, but most races, how to say, go up to 100 miles, which is like 170, 180 kilometers, um, and can last even though over 1 to 2 days. So running for 24 hours up to 30 hours. So it's quite demanding for physical and some people say psychological aspect. For instance, I found a study I can cite over here. The last big race I did was called the UTMB race in Chamonix in France. And basically, you consume around 13,000 to 16,000 calories just within this one race. So, this is a race around the whole massif of Mont Blanc in France. So, you start the race in France, you run to Italy, from Italy into Switzerland, and from Switzerland back to France. Why I'm telling that? Because during this race in preparation, during training, I think this is the really interesting part about it. I came across two kind of narratives, I would say, a little bit of like in group and out group. In the group of people who were training together with me in my training group, this is in the light blue down. They were talking or complaining like it's so extreme doing nothing, lying on the couch. So they were speaking normally. There's like 6 days of training, 1 day off. It's so extreme if people don't do any sports. So within this group, they were very disappointed if somebody's not doing sports, especially on that high performance or long endurance way. Whereas when I was talking to other people who were not participating in that sport, they said like that's extreme. Mentioning, let's say, the object, that's extreme. So it's the thing that you're doing is extreme. Up to people say you are extreme, making the behavior that you have a part of your personality in some sense. And here also, and this was the point where it became a little bit, let's say, clinical, interesting, you guys can live a normal life. So what does normal mean, especially in terms of life evaluation? So, in a nutshell, what I could say is there is a sort of like social perspective, let's say, between in group and out group. And what I was able to find out is that, like, okay, whatever is extreme, it seems to be out group. Um, it's always the others. It's never the people you're close to. It's to show some distance. So I tended to look a little bit further and thought, like, okay, so how normal is it or not? What you can see on the current slide, hopefully the video is working, you can see the change in the US of 100-mile races between the year 2000 and 2023. So what you can see is there's quite a high number of such ultra endurance races starting up that have not been existing in previous years. Um, for a better overview, I did the both years in comparison, so the map of the US in 2000 and the map in 2023. And what you can see is there's like a tremendous increase in doing such races and in this performance idea. So what I looked at was, or what thought I got, what hypothesis I got in this moment is like there is a high increase in performance doing ultra long endurance sports, like extreme performance. And I started to question, like, but is this a global phenomenon? Is this something like Western or is this something global? And I looked especially also out of interest to Japan, and I can tell you, Japan is full in, so it seems to be a global phenomenon. Kagoshima being the first one being part of UTMB series, so one of these 100-kilometer runs maybe the most prominent race in Japan that I came across, also talking with the community, is the so-called Mount Fuji trail running race, Mount Fuji 100. It's a 100-mile race in normally in April, quite nearly around all around Mount Fuji. And so in this global sphere of like these developing races around the world, as a first example, well, for those who now thought during my talk, wow, great, let's have some fun, do such a race. I have bad news when it comes to Mount Fuji 100. It's already closed. You cannot apply to take part for 26. You have to wait for 27. But I also have good news. You can still register for Kakaspal 100K. So if you want to join and say like, okay, let's do that, there is still some open spots to go for. So I thought like, okay, but maybe this is just sports. This is maybe just a very, very small thing I'm after. And so I started also to look at food, which was more accidentally. It started to happen. I was changing flights at the Barcelona airport in Spain 2 years ago. And what I found over there was like next in a shop, McDonald's, and they started this series of burgers called McExtreme. And McExtreme is doing advertising, and I would say, I mean, it's maybe a little bit of a prejudice, but like I think people in marketing at McDonald's basically they know what to do and they're well trained in what they do. And they introduced Mac Extreme with support bestial, like bestial taste. And I started to think like, okay, so how can something be so attractive? Because bestial taste doesn't sound good to me. It sounds extreme. Yes, it does, but not tasty. So how can it become so interesting to sell something as being extreme? Well, this brought me to the point that I said, like, okay, there seems to be a tendency or a need to name things as being extreme. And now I would like also to connect again with Japan and Japanese food. There also seems to be a tendency to do extreme, and there is no need to name it extreme. And this is the following. I would say fugu. I found the saying, I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation, fugu wa kuitashi nochi wa oshishi. So I want to eat pufferfish, but I value my life. So basically, also when I was speaking to people, eating pufferfish is like everyday experience. Basically, it's one of the most dangerous toxins, tetrodotoxin, that could kill you. But I think it's not big of a deal. So what I came across was, okay, there seems to be an idea or an interest in labeling the extreme on some side, at least. And there seems also to be an interest in doing extreme things, but you don't need to label it. So the moment you do it, you don't have to label it. The moment you label it, you're not doing it. It seems like these are two counterparts of each other. So I thought, okay, maybe I can trust in science. And I thought about, okay, how can I get into some scientific examples, or how can I manage to have a first empirical um, attempt to what I would like to look at. And I did so by looking at scientific journals and their wording. So I looked up which journals are using the word extreme, for instance, and I found extremes, statistical theory and application. So, okay, statistical theory, I felt like this is maybe none of my interest, basically. It's a mathematical model, it's something different, and not really has to do with what I understand by extremes. But then I looked at like extreme journal of extreme events, um, Journal of Weather and Climate Extremes, Extreme Manufacturing, Journal of Extreme Anthropology, Journal of Human Performance in Extreme Environments. And basically, what I found out is it seems they also do not have any definition. It seems that somebody hands in something they believe which is extreme, um, but we don't know what really extreme means in that case or not. So I wanted to get more concrete. And I looked at the aim and scope sections of these journals, and what I found was not very sufficient, I would say. For instance, originally research on all spec, okay, that's the statistical one. But extreme events on natural and human systems. Okay, what is extreme events? Where do they start? What's the threshold for that? Types of extremes. Okay, so we're trying to classify weather and climate extremes, but who is saying that it is extreme? It seems to have a very, very individual perspective in it. The same to human performance in extreme environment. So when does something become an extreme environment? Is this like globally acceptable, or isn't that really biased in some way? So I thought, okay, maybe I can count on PubMed. So I did a short analysis on the keyword extreme, looking at it, how many times the word extreme gets used, starting from abstracts, titles, subtitles, and keywords. And what I found out in my little query was that in around 38 million articles, there is an increasing number in PubMed. Year by year, I would even say nearly logarithmic in chart, how often the word extreme gets used in publishing. And that's interesting to see. How to say, we cannot draw any conclusions from that, but it's interesting to see um, that there is a tendency, even in scientific language, to mark something by doing so. So next point, I looked at the extreme wording again, and I thought about like, okay, let's look at the results per 100,000 citations. So seeing the proportion for each year, because every year there is more material published. So maybe this is arbitrary, what I was looking at in this logarithmic chart. But what we can clearly see is that we have a linear increase year by year, um, getting stronger on what interest we have naming the extreme. What I cannot explain is what we can see over here basically is that there is in 1974, there seems to be a gap that we start using the word of extreme and then we go on in a linear way. I cannot explain that. I don't have an explanation so far. If somebody has an idea, I'm more than happy to share ideas about it. But what I can say is, in a first sort of summary, so there seems to be an increased necessity in the use of the word. I think I was able to make that clear. A clear definition does not seem to be given in any way, talking about the extreme, even if it's attempted to do so, because scientific journals tend to be concrete and precise. And it's postulated or formulated there might be a structure of extremes to be assumed, possibly connecting phenomena in some way, but this is not fully clear. So I was at the point to say, like, okay, how can I link extremes with psychology? What do these first investigations, let's say, can tell me about psychology, or what does psychology have to do with extremes? And basically that means, so what's the purpose to talking about psychology? So, out of the way I was trained, let's say, and educated, I started to look at applied psychology, in other words, clinical psychology and treatment. And there, extremes get a very specific understanding or rating. The role of extremes in understanding sanity and insanity. Because what is, let's say, the classic approach when we speak about uh, clinical diagnostics? It's exactly what I think every psychologist already has learned in the bachelor years. The classic approach is a statistical standardization with plus minus two standard deviations. So anything that is far away, let's say left-sided or right-sided over plus minus two standard deviations is deviant and therefore out of scope and not normal anymore. In other words, basically meaning not sane anymore. So what I could say at that moment is that extreme experiences therefore lie at the edge of human existence when it becomes when we're interested in pathologization. So the model I would like to do proposes a re-evaluation of extremes, saying that they're meaningful states relevant to psychological development and not only being interpreted as maybe harmful to human existence. What I really like in this context is to look at the quotation of Kellerman, life cannot be cured. I think also life is not to be cured, but the best we can do is to offer our patients the ability to develop tools with which to struggle and maybe to struggle better. No more, no less. That's what we can do in clinical psychology and psychotherapy. And at this point, I would like to go a little bit into the work of Michel Foucault and his work, Mental Illness and Psychology. And the point I see so interesting in his research is saying that although they meaning the psychologists, showed the forms of appearance of the illness, they have been unable to show its conditions of appearance. And with my concept of extremes in psychology, I would like exactly to nail down, let's say, to speak about showing the conditions of appearance and not the forms of appearance of illness. So to see the difference exactly and speak about what conditions need to be that something can happen. And I think extremes do play a consistent role in that evaluation. Furthermore, um, mental illness has its reality different to physical illness, has its reality and its value qua illness, as an illness, only within a culture that recognizes it as such. So, beside this individual understanding of what extremes could maybe play part in, dealing about illness or not, we also need to look at the outer perspective, let's say the sociological component and the inclusive component of culture, recognizing it as such. So I would like to summarize at this point again and say, okay, A, um, patients prepare and get prepared with tools. Okay, I can say that from a clinical point of view. Psychology shows how illness is on a descriptive level, diagnostic descriptive level, but not why. Sometimes where we could discuss in physiology, neurophysiology, biology, MRT, MRI. And C, there needs to be some cultural framework which leads to a common understanding of illness. And this, I think, includes extreme experiences. So, what are extremes made of? In the next step, I started to try to divide extremes in their um, components, so to say. And I registered three different parts. I said there's like a situational component, which deals with the external circumstance, like the passively enduring. I will explain in a moment what I mean by that. The dispositional component, so that's the part of like people actively seeking extreme, living through and interpreting such experiences, so wanting to have such specific experiences, and the experiential component, so external circumstances that shape life events. For instance, you can't lose a job if you're retired. You can't face a breakup if you're single. or deal with a child's illness if you have no children. So some specific, let's say the experiential component is very individual, containing on personal relations and situations. So the situational component, I would explain following that um, human science often approach extremes in a one-sided way. Bruno Bettelheim's experience, what I'm referring here to, Bruno Bettelheim's experience illustrates this very vividly. Um, he, as a psychologist and psychoanalyst, was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp in 1938 to 1939. And later in the US, he reflected on these experiences in his work, arguing that extreme situations break down familiar coping mechanisms and force a complete psychological reorganization. So they are not defined only by suffering, but by a radical rupture with the familiar, a threshold that can destroy and transform. Bettelheim at that time also drew on Freud's concept of the death drive to explain the destructive forces that emerge in such contexts, and his insights remind us that extreme experiences challenge our values and demand new ways of thinking and living. So we fail familiar coping strategies, we require reorientation, and that's what I would see as the situational component. And that's maybe overlapping with trauma theory, just as a little excursion to also see like where do I come from and where do I want to live? So I would like to leave trauma theory because trauma means the involuntary happening response maybe to extreme situations, to extreme experiences. Um, and extremes, so to say, are the voluntary, chosen, and created ones. So whereas trauma is a response, a negative response, let's say, to a situation that is overwhelming, which can be extreme, or of course is extreme, because otherwise it would not be overwhelming. Extremes don't need to be that. They might have a constructive side, which means like if you're speaking about trauma over here, it's the part of event factors that we're dealing with, which is not part of the extremes. The opposite, I try to oppose extreme experiences from these event factors of trauma theory. In the dispositional component, so to deepen this perspective, psychoanalysis has been expanded through ethnopsychoanalysis, I would say, which links unconscious processes to cultural context. It shows that the unconscious is shaped by social structures and symbolic orders and is not isolated within the individual. This helps us avoid labeling extreme experience, such as ritual practices, as pathological. Instead, we can understand them as culturally framed expressions of inner conflict and transformation. And for that, I would like to give a case example, a very short one, Sirima's case of firewalking as a spiritual empowerment. And as I said, cultural context shapes the interpretations of extremes. So, the example of firewalking. This striking example of Sirima is documented by Obasekere in Sri Lanka. Um, Sirima was facing a family crisis. She turned to pilgrimage and firewalking, not as an escape, but as a symbolic act of self-empowerment. She remained unharmed in fire, and that gave her a sense of triumph and inner peace, um, even amiding social and marital breakdown. So over time, she became a religious innovator, introducing new rituals and gaining recognition in her community by doing so. So Sirima's story shows that extreme experiences can mark turning points, enabling new identities and meaning making. So what might seem irrational or pathological in a Western medical view appears in its cultural frame as healing and transformative. So these practices are not symptoms of disorders, but creative responses, I would call them, to existential crisis, and moments that can destroy but also profoundly transform. In the last part, the experiential component, it is about life events that they are not to be seen random, that context matters. Um, this is also interesting if we look at biographies, for instance, of martyrs and spiritual figures that show extremes as being meaningful, and cultural narratives that influence the perception of extremes. And what I see as challenging, let's say, is the change in society, I would say, of um, the last decade, which I would like to explain by the following. So I'm going back to Otto Rank in the early 20th century. The book is called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. So basically, what's the main thesis of Otto Rank? He's saying there are patterns and motifs in a classical hero myth. I'm speaking now about Western classical myth. I have no clue how this is to be seen, let's say, in Japan or Far Eastern philosophy. But what you have in Western traditional mythology is you normally have a prophecy or premonition. Then you have the hero who is in danger in his childhood or her childhood. And there is a phase of abandonment and exposition, followed by rescue and care by a stranger or family. And this leads to rediscovery and return. And basically, this results then in the average saga or the average myth. And to exemplify that a little bit better, I thought about the example, very classic, Oedipus as a hero. So, in the classic drama, in three acts of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, it's a classic example for this heroic narrative in Greek mythology. And the essential elements of Oedipus' story follow precisely the patterns that are described by Rank. So first there is the prophecy. So King Laius is told that his son will one day kill him and marry his mother. I think the story knows everybody. So this prediction sets the course of the story in motion. So there becomes the danger and exposure situation. To prevent this fate, King Laius abandons his infant son Oedipus and orders to kill him. But instead, Oedipus is saved by a shepherd. So there is the rescue and adaptation. Oedipus is adopted by another royal couple and grows up unaware of his true origins. And finally, there is the rediscovery and return. So, as an adult, Oedipus learns of the prophecy and leaves his presumed parents to avoid fulfilling it. Ironically, this leads him to unknowingly meet his mother, meet his biological parents, kill his father, and marry his mother, so fulfilling the prophecy. So the story of Oedipus not only illustrates themes of fate and identity, but also the psychological tension between the individual and their origins, as Rank describes it. But what we can, or what I was able to detect in change, let's say, which I was talking about, is so this change from the myth and the average saying to everyone once, everyone can be a hero. So a sort of like a desire, I call it the desire to be extraordinary. And this is described by the evolution of singularities. So, does symbolic perception disappear through singularization? And does this mean that there is more need for extreme coming out of these situations? And therefore, I'm reflecting on Reckwitz, 2020, sociologist, um, talking about living in a society of singularities. So he uses the term society of singularities, meaning that how can we detect a society of singularities? We see it through the process of individualization and the need in authenticity. We see a cultural economy of singularities, meaning that there is an interest to sell ideas that be named as being special or outstanding for an individual. We see it in the fight for recognition of individuals to get recognized for their performance or what they do. And we can also see it in an aestheticization of everyday life. So meaning, making meaning of the own life by trying to aesthetically put new special content into it. So an entity is considered singular in a socio-cultural context when it is not seen as just another copy of a general type, but as something truly particular. It appears unique, incomparable, and non-interchangeable. So singularity refers to a specific quality that cannot be reduced to numbers or measured against general standards. In the realm of generality, things can differ better or worse, more or less, but remain comparable. Singularities, by contrast, are not simply variations, they have a completely different quality. They stand apart, distinct, and for that reason, they cannot be exchanged or replaced. And basically, I understand extremes also as an idea of singularization and singularities. So that means we need to ask the question, can a comparison of extremes take place? And I would say no, due to the fact that they are singularities, and therefore comparison seems not be um, a, a model to go for or to use. So summarizing requisites, we can say we speak about uniqueness in a socio-cultural context that is looked for, searched by individuals, looking for quality instead of quantity in that sense to get this special one performance out of it. And this leads to a differentiation between generality and uniqueness. So it needs to be, or it starts to be unique, leading to, as I already said, to incomparability and non-interchangeability within the system. So I'm giving another example. How could that look like, or what could it mean? What I put on that slide is basically on all these three images show advertising for doing holiday in Italy in Rimini. Basically, what you see on the left side is advertising from the 1922, the year of 1922. And if you look at this drawing, what you can see is you see a lot of people in the background, activity, and a huge crowd. So the interest of like having a joint festival over there, it looks more like a year market. Um, Spending time together and exchanging. And what you see on the right side is on top the image that is used by one of the biggest holiday companies, selling companies in Austria, as an advertising for this place going on holidays. So this individual, restful, peaceful place on earth, which is only for you. Nobody's gonna be there. It's like totally individualized. And what you see down the second image is what it actually looks like. So there is also a huge attempt and interest, let's say, in fantasizing about this extreme individualization or attempt to do special, to do something unique. Um, Even maybe up to smartphones. When you do a picture, you can delete other people in the picture to show that you have been alone and no other people are in the background. Another example I prepared for today is, yeah, sorry, it's again a sports example, a running example. This was the marathon advertising at the Marathon of Amsterdam in 2023, and they were advertising with "Run your masterpiece, become part of history." And the interesting is, if you look at or if you could recognize the use masterpiece and the use of the word masterpiece. Masterpiece in Amsterdam is normally concerning the old masters like Rubens, paintings of classical paintings of a completely different century. And what changes is exactly so this let's say saga or like this hero ethos of like the old masters, high crafted individuals doing wonderful artwork, to you becoming yourself the masterpiece or doing the masterpiece, so becoming yourself a master. So the change from um, the master, let's say, outside the observation and evaluation, that leads now to valorization of the own performance instead of the performance of others. So, but what we're still doing in that moment is we're looking from an outside perspective, and we need to acknowledge extremes are essential for understanding human discourse. Psychology often pathologizes extremes as deviations, and we're in deep need for a model that proposes a differentiated, context-sensitive framework from within human psyche. So we need to gain inside perspective instead of only having this outside perspective. And this is what I would like to do, let's say, in my general theoretical application, as I call it. So I was working on the model, on a multi-dimensional model, how we could basically understand extremes on an individualistic uh, ego or from inside, let's call it inside perspective. And um, that looks the following. So, first of all, I would like to understand extremes as being part in developmental phenomenon. So, as I said before, extremes, and as we had it with the three components, or like the case of Sirima, extremes are not just dysfunctional or dysfunctions, but can be meaningful. Extremes are essential for understanding human discourse, and psychology often pathologizes extremes as deviations. And the model I'm proposing is proposing a differentiated, context sensitive framework, therefore. Um, but that also means that we need to criticize clinical psychology, I would say, or psychology itself from a methodological point of view. Um, Psychology often misinterprets extremes due to flawed methods. Um, for that, I would like to shortly speak about Mayle's critique, highlighting issues in theory hypothesis linkage. So, um, I name especially three problems of Mayle's critique. One is the ceteris paribus clause. So, for example, the assumption that all other conditions remain constant is particularly fragile in research on extremes. Um, Extreme conditions, so if we speak about the environment, normally rapidly change. Research that was done so far about extreme situations might be quite biased. There's also editorial publication bias that plays a role. Journals favor significant and often um, pathologizing results. So this leads to a literature in which extremes appear almost exclusively as an expression of disorder. or complex disorders. So another word how to frame it in clinical psychology is, for instance, with trauma, complex trauma. And Mail warns against the uncritical acceptance of validity claims for psychometric instruments. So if a test is considered valid, even though it's inadequately reflecting complex phenomena such as extremes, the findings derived from it can be very misleading. And so we are in need for a reflexive, context-aware research on extremes. So I tried to do a first definition, let's say, um, the extreme as a relational dynamic phenomenon, which receives its meaning as a linguistic code of a starter that is usually constituted precisely by the fact that it lies beyond normal distributions or standard values. So therefore, maybe gold standard methods do not necessarily seem to be suitable for understanding the extreme. In other words, um, how could that look like, or what could we see if we talk about that? We could see extremes from a relative and absolute point of view. So most conditions I'm speaking about today, I would call relative extremes. So we deal with two variables that have a certain relationship to each other. Most likely that's psychological content, whereas this relationship can rapidly change and basically is on the interpretation of a single individual. Absolute extremes in comparison, we deal with given or absolute content. For instance, the physical properties of climbing the highest mountain. So if you have climbed Mount Everest, there is no chance to climb a higher mountain. There might be the chance to climb a more complex mountain, but there is no chance to climb a higher one as you have done from from height, definitely the absolute highest mountain. Um, so most of the extremes from a cultural perspective and within clinical psychology are relative extremes and are related to personal perception of the situation. So before I started to operate this six-dimensional model, it all started with the so-called like triangle of extremes. The idea was that time matters and intensity. So what you see is if something, for instance, could be uh, on on strong intensity, but happening very slow, it can be extreme. Um, for instance, preparing for something specific, preparing for some specific event. I don't know, PhD defense, or this time I think many people would share as being an extreme situation. Or I think today bachelor students at Ritsumaikon handed in their bachelor thesis. So they did quite tremendous long time to prepare for this moment. So they might experience it as an extreme situation. Or how to say, the intensity level could be very low, but it could happen very fast. So, for instance, if you have a little bump, little car accident, but nobody gets hurt, so you have a little moment of shock. So when you come home, you might say, like, oh, today was extreme in traffic. I had a car accident, but nothing happened. So the impact is, or the intensity is very low, whereas in time perception, it happened very fast. So basically, the fast time perception was would make you for a moment to think about it in extreme. And this basic initial idea led to formulate or think more and get more into the dimensions of like, okay, so what dimensions do we need to address when we're talking about the extreme? Um, I defined it by a six-dimensional model, which I call like toward a differentiated conceptualization of extreme experience and their psychological relevance. So the six dimensions we identified in my team was The first dimension is, which was the starting dimension, intensity. So basically, in this dimension, we have like two aspects or two poles from overwhelming situations to, on the other side, numbness, which would be the outmost, let's say, of not being overwhelmed, so being numbed. We have a second dimension called impact, which is between transformation and stabilization. So this would be the two poles that describe impact. So how intense is the situation? How much impact does it have? How demanding is it? Dimension number three, which we would have the two poles of exertion and ease. Is something making it even easier for me? Does it bring ease to me or does it do exertion to me? Um, Bringing me to dimension number four, where we speak about control. So gaining or losing control. Does the current situation, does the current happening make me gain or lose control about what I'm doing? Novelty, how new is it to me? Is the situation new? So here is also quite a huge part of, let's say, the cultural perspective. How ritualized is the situation maybe? So if it's not new, it might be ritualized. I'm doing it on a daily basis. This is the very first time it happened to me, doing a change, leading also to identification. So, how involving or how detaching is this situation? Also bringing maybe some unconscious movement to it. So, a little bit more in detail, intensity. Don't want to go too much into detail. So dimension of intensity describes the extent of emotional, cognitive, or physical arousal. So going from overwhelming overstimulation to emotional numbness. And the question we can ask is a basic question is like, how intense does it feel to be in this situation? The impact dimension reflects the extent to which an experience can lead to transformation or serve to restore and maintain psychological stability. So the question we could ask ourselves over here, how much does my life get affected by the situation, by this extreme situation, or not extreme situation? We need to find out. Demand dimension refers to the mental or physical effort that is required by a situation ranging from states of intense exertion to those characterized by ease. So, how demanding is this situation for me? Control concerns the subjective experience of gaining or losing control. So, am I in control of the current situation or not? Novelty dimension describes the degree of unfamiliarity of an experience within an individual or cultural context, ranging from states of newness to those characterized by ritualism. So, is this new to me? And how different the situation is from my prior experiences, and how acceptable is it in my individual's society? And last but not least, identification, highlighting the degree of personal connection to an experience ranging from strong involvement to detached observation. So, do I identify with the current situation? And therefore, does it conclude for me being extreme or not? So, how to make sense of these six dimensions? We're nearly at the end of my presentation already. So I thought about like, okay, how could we visualize that in the model? And my idea was to do this in the radar chart. So basically, this is an artificial example how somebody could rate, for instance, the experience of climbing Mount Everest, being a tourist. So the intensity, it could be very overwhelming. It could lead to a film of transformation. It's quite an exertion. It feels like a huge loss of control. And it's very new. It's the first time doing something like climbing 8,000 meters. And in identification, it needs a lot of involvement to make this happen and survive the suffering and go for it. And in comparison, let's say we speak again about climbing Mount Everest, but this time by a guide, by a professional mountain guide, maybe by a Sherpa. So the intensity is still, there is intensity there, and there might be overwhelming moment, but it's much lower. So it might be even more stabilizing than a transforming moment, helping to identify by climbing it again and again and again. So for maybe being the 15th time on top of Mount Everest, so it stabilizes their own personality in some way in the impact. It's more on the ease side than on exertion because I know what I'm doing. I'm in gain of control of the situation. I'm quite clear about it. It might already have something ritualistic and in identification. Well, it's neither involving than detaching, let's say. So what I would like to show is if we see these two slides, one on each other, and the difference is if we look at the particular patterns, we could assume that, for instance, climbing it the first time shows much more colored space in use, meaning that this means there is more extremity to it. So what I would like to show with this model is to classify and work on the threshold of what extremes can be, so we are able to start identifying and be able to rate when does something become extreme for a human being, to also see when do we enter maybe this possible uh, this possible demanding space of critical evaluation or danger that also destructive or constructive personality change can happen from a clinical perspective. So I would like to conclude, let's say, being in need of the extreme is like going back to my starting quotes. I'm not extreme, but maybe I do extreme. And how does this lead to my identity construction? This is basically what I'm looking at. I need the extreme to be able to create parts of my identity without maybe even knowing about its entity. And extremes are therefore part of human development, not just pathology. With my six-dimensional model, I would like to offer nuanced understanding of what it means, and I try to encourage integrative, context-sensitive research and therapy by that way. Um, so what am I doing? Current projects is within cultural psychology. I would like to look at variations within the field, so to maybe get rid of my Westerners bias, hopefully at least a little bit, also with your help here in Japan, and looking at the phenomenology of extremes. I would also like to go back a little bit in the trauma and treatment research, looking for the transition and threshold to be better to identify when situations get critical. This also meaning finding back to, how to say, whatever we call normal life, let's say in a clinical sphere, um, and also seeing the differentiation in outcome of extreme experiences. And also because I think it's simply nice to have an exchange on that topic, but with a different focus, looking at recreational leisure sports. Currently, we're working on an application, big application for ERC, European Research Council, for a grant, looking for changes in pain perception during ultra endurance races. So, what can we learn? Yes, this ultra endurance running also has a lot to do with pain. So, what can we learn maybe in pain perception and dealing with pain and pain strategies from people who like to or who can stand pain for a very long time? Maybe also personality traits within extreme endurance sports. Um, Interesting also hallucinations. Where is the drag aspect, let's say, looking for escapism and addiction. So if I have made opened up your mind and got you interested a little bit more, Here is a QR code. So if you want to read my latest publication where you can find quite some information and some parts of the today's talk, it's summarized in this publication from late October 25. And if you're more interested on the clinical side, it's currently in the second round of review. So we hope to hopefully publish it by January in Current Psychology. So rethinking trauma beyond the extreme, a critical inquiry into small t trauma theory and its clinical implications. So I would like to thank you for listening. I'm more than thankful, especially I would say to my team. They are working with me in Vienna, especially Natalie Rodax, who is a colleague and since many years a good friend, exchange partner for ideas. Priscilla and Anna doing their PhD with me, and Tivike, who's an exchange student currently. I would also thank my old-time mentor, Professor Jan Valsina. And especially I would like to thank today Professor Tatsuya Sato and Associate Professor Teppei Tsuchimoto for hosting me, having me here today, and um, yes, working with me, hopefully constructively, for the next 12 months. So I just put my references over here. If somebody needs it, I can also send the slides. So from my side, thank you for your cooperation and listening so far. And I'm open now for the question section. And I think, Tepe, this is the moment you take over, if I understood correctly.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And